The sun was setting over the city skyline as people dressed in their finest clothes made their way into the grand concert hall. The air buzzed with excitement. Tonight was not just any performance, it was Thomas Hill's annual charity concert, an event that had become legendary over the years. Thomas was not just a pianist. He was considered one of the greatest musicians of his generation. His fingers could dance across the keys in ways that seemed almost magical, bringing tears to the eyes of even the toughest critics. But Thomas was known for something else too, his playful personality and the way he liked to involve his audience in unexpected ways. Did you hear what he did last year? A woman whispered to her husband as they found their seats. He asked someone to conduct while he played, and it turned out the man had never even been to a classical concert before. Her husband chuckled. That's why these tickets sell out in minutes. You never know what's going to happen. Behind the stage, Thomas adjusted his bow tie in the mirror. At 45, his dark hair was starting to gray at the temples, giving him what the music magazines called a distinguished look. His face had the kind of wrinkles that come from smiling too much rather than frowning. "Full house tonight," said Robert, his manager, poking his head through the dressing room door. "And we've already raised over $50,000 for the children's music program." Thomas nodded, pleased. He had grown up in a neighborhood where music lessons were a luxury few could afford. Now that he had made it, supporting young musicians from similar backgrounds was the most important thing to him, even more important than the awards lining his studio walls. "Any special plans for tonight's show?" Robert asked, knowing Thomas's tendency to go off script. Thomas smiled mysteriously. "Let's just say I might need a volunteer." The lights dimmed and the audience fell silent as the stage lights came up. Thomas walked out, tall and confident in his black tuxedo. The applause was immediate and thunderous. He took a deep bow, then sat at the gleaming black grand piano that waited center stage. For the first hour, he played pieces by Beethoven and Liszt, his hands moving with such speed and precision that people in the front rows leaned forward, trying to catch every movement. The music filled the hall, sometimes soft as a whisper, sometimes powerful as a storm. During a brief intermission, people chatted excitedly about the performance so far. In the third row, Rose Chen sat quietly, absorbing the atmosphere. At 56, she was not the typical concert-goer in this wealthy crowd. Her simple blue dress had been carefully chosen for the occasion, and she had saved for months to buy her ticket. Rose's daughter had gifted her the ticket for her birthday, knowing how much her mother loved piano music. "You work too hard, Mom," she had said. "Take a night off from the shop and enjoy yourself." The shop was a small grocery store that Rose had run for nearly 20 years since coming to the country. What most people didn't know, what her customers who greeted her cheerfully every day didn't know, was that Rose had once lived a very different life. The lights dimmed again, signaling the start of the second half. Thomas returned to the stage, but this time he approached the microphone before sitting at the piano. "Music is a conversation," he said, his voice warm and engaging. A conversation between the composer and the performer, between the performer and the audience. But sometimes, he paused dramatically, sometimes we need to shake things up a bit. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. This was what many had been waiting for, the moment when Thomas Hill did something unexpected. "For this next piece, I think I need some help," he said, his eyes scanning the audience. "I need someone brave enough to come up here and play with me." Nervous laughter filled the hall. People glanced at each other, some sinking lower in their seats to avoid being chosen, others straightening up hopefully. Thomas stepped to the edge of the stage, shielding his eyes from the lights to see better. His gaze moved across the first few rows and then stopped. "You, ma'am," he said, pointing directly at Rose, in the lovely blue dress. "Would you honor us by coming up here?" Rose froze. Around her, people turned to look, some with envy, others with relief that they hadn't been chosen. She shook her head slightly, but Thomas was persistent. "Come on," he encouraged, his smile charming and just a little mischievous. "I promise I won't bite." A young usher appeared at the end of her row, offering his hand to help her out. With her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it, Rose slowly stood up and made her way to the aisle. The walk to the stage felt like the longest journey of her life. She could feel hundreds of eyes following her, could hear the whispers and the polite applause encouraging her. She wondered if they could see her hands shaking. Thomas reached down to help her up the steps to the stage, his grip firm and reassuring. But there was something in his eyes, a twinkle of amusement that told Rose he had chosen her partly as a joke. She didn't fit the image of a pianist. Her hands were those of a working woman with short nails and a few age spots. She wasn't young or glamorous. To him, she probably looked like someone who had never touched a piano in her life. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, the microphone carrying his voice across the hall. "Rose," she answered, her voice so quiet that he had to lean closer. "Everyone, please welcome Rose," he announced, and the audience applauded politely. Leading her to the piano, Thomas gestured for her to sit on the bench. "Do you play, Rose?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already assumed the answer was no. A few chuckles came from the audience. Rose could see some people smiling indulgently, waiting for the joke to unfold, waiting for her to plink out a few awkward notes before Thomas would take over, saving the situation with his brilliance. "A little," she said softly, and Thomas raised his eyebrows theatrically for the audience's benefit. "Well, Rose," he said, "I thought perhaps we could play a duet. Something simple. Do you know Heart and Soul? Or maybe Chopsticks?" More laughter from the audience. These were pieces that children learned, pieces that amateurs played at parties. Rose looked at the keyboard, the familiar pattern of black and white keys that she hadn't touched in public for so long. For a moment she considered playing along with his joke, hunching her shoulders and pecking out a simple tune while everyone smiled at how cute it was. This ordinary woman pretending to be a musician, but something inside her stirred, a memory of who she had once been, of dreams set aside but never truly forgotten. "Actually," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice, "I was thinking of something else." Thomas looked taken aback for a moment, then recovered with a showman's ease. "By all means," he said, gesturing to the piano with an exaggerated flourish. "The stage is yours." He stepped back, giving her space but staying close enough to step in when she inevitably struggled. He gave the audience a quick wink, inviting them to share in the gentle prank. Rose sat at the piano, adjusting the bench slightly. She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the audience, the magnificent hall, and even Thomas with his barely concealed amusement. She took a deep breath, remembering a time when music had been her entire world. No one in the audience could have guessed that 35 years ago, Rose had been a promising young pianist in her homeland, that she had practiced 8 hours a day in a small apartment with paper-thin walls, that she had performed in competitions and even won a few. No one could have known that life had taken her in a different direction, that marriage, children, immigration, and the hard work of building a new life had pulled her away from music. But she had never stopped playing, not completely. In the back room of her shop, she kept an old upright piano. Late at night after closing, she would sometimes play for hours, her fingers remembering what her heart could never forget. Now, as her hands hovered over the keys of this magnificent instrument, so different from her weathered upright, Rose felt a mixture of terror and something like coming home. The hall had grown completely silent. Everyone was waiting, ready for the joke to reach its punchline. Rose placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes that flowed from Rose's fingers surprised everyone, most of all Thomas. She began with a gentle flowing melody that seemed to rise from somewhere deep within her soul. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that required both technical skill and emotional depth. Thomas's smile froze on his face. He had expected her to fumble awkwardly over the keys, perhaps manage a simple tune at best. Instead, her fingers moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The joke he had planned was quickly unraveling. In the audience, people who had been settling in for a moment of light entertainment suddenly sat up straighter. The woman in the simple blue dress was playing, really playing, and not just hitting the right notes but bringing the music to life. Rose kept her eyes closed at first, focusing only on the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers. It had been so long since she had played on a piano this fine, an instrument that responded to the lightest touch, that carried every nuance of emotion she poured into it. The sound filled the concert hall, washing over the audience like gentle waves. When she finally opened her eyes, she didn't look at the audience or at Thomas. She looked only at her hands, watching them move across the keyboard as if they belonged to someone else, someone from her past who had once dreamed of playing in halls like this. Thomas stood to the side, his expression shifting from surprise to curiosity and then to something else, a growing respect. He was a true musician at heart, and he could recognize genuine talent when he heard it. The prank he had intended suddenly seemed small and mean-spirited in the face of what was happening before him. As Rose played the final notes of the nocturne, there was a moment of silence followed by scattered applause. Some people looked confused. This wasn't the amusing scene they had expected. Others leaned forward, wondering what would happen next. Thomas stepped closer to the piano. "That was beautiful," he said, and this time there was no trace of mockery in his voice. "Chopin has always been one of my favorites." Rose nodded, her hands now resting quietly in her lap. "Mine too," she said softly. A new understanding passed between them, musician to musician. Thomas made a quick decision. "Would you play something else for us?" he asked, and this time it was a genuine request, not part of a joke. Rose hesitated, suddenly aware again of all the eyes watching her. The safe thing would be to politely decline, to stand up and return to her seat, to slip back into anonymity. But the feel of the piano keys was like meeting an old friend after many years apart. How could she walk away now? "What would you like to hear?" she asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "Whatever speaks to you," he said. Rose took a deep breath. If she was going to do this, really do this, then she would play the piece that had lived in her heart all these years, through all the hard times, through all the days when music had seemed like a distant dream. She positioned her hands once more and began to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for someone who hadn't performed publicly in decades, but the music had been her companion for so long that it felt like part of her. The opening chords rang out, powerful and demanding. This was not the gentle Chopin piece she had just played. This was music that required everything she had, that would expose any weakness or hesitation. But Rose gave herself over to it completely. In the wings of the stage, Robert, Thomas's manager, watched with his mouth slightly open. "Who is she?" he whispered to one of the stagehands. The stagehand shrugged. "Just some lady from the audience, I thought." "But she plays like she should be the one giving the concert," Robert finished for him. On stage, Thomas had moved closer to the piano, watching Rose's hands with professional interest. Her technique wasn't perfect. There were moments of slight hesitation, small imperfections that revealed her long absence from serious practice. But there was something in her playing that went beyond technique, a raw emotional honesty that many professional musicians spent their entire careers trying to achieve. In the third row, where Rose had been sitting, her seatmates exchanged amazed glances. "Did you know she could play like that?" an older gentleman asked the woman next to him. "I've never seen her before in my life," the woman replied. "I thought she worked at a shop or something." As the concerto built to one of its most challenging passages, Rose's fingers flew across the keys. A light sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead, but her face showed only concentration and a kind of joy that had been absent earlier. This wasn't about the audience anymore, or about Thomas, or about proving anything to anyone. This was about Rose and the music, reunited after too long apart. Thomas found himself holding his breath during certain passages, willing her to make it through the difficult sections. When she navigated a particularly complex part successfully, he felt a surge of pride that surprised him. Why should he feel proud? He didn't know this woman. And yet, as a fellow musician, he understood what it took to play this way. In the audience, the initial confusion had given way to rapt attention. People who had come to see Thomas Hill, the famous pianist, found themselves captivated by this unknown woman. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others watched, fascinated by the transformation taking place before them, how the ordinary-looking woman in the blue dress seemed to grow more radiant with each note she played. As Rose approached the end of the movement, she faced her greatest challenge yet. Her fingers, unused to such demanding playing after so many years, began to tire. A small voice of doubt crept in. Could she finish what she had started? She glanced up for the first time since beginning the Rachmaninoff and found Thomas watching her. There was no mockery in his expression now, only encouragement and understanding. He gave her a small nod as if to say, "You can do this." Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she had, Rose pushed through the fatigue. The music swelled, filling every corner of the concert hall. In that moment, all the years fell away, the years of working in the small shop, the years of playing only for herself late at night when no one could hear. the years of setting aside her dreams for more practical concerns. When she struck the final chords, the sound seemed to hang in the air for a long moment before fading. Rose sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. What had she done? Had she made a fool of herself after all? Trying to play a piece that professional pianists spent months preparing. The silence stretched for one heartbeat, then two. And then the applause began. Scattered at first, then growing, spreading through the audience like wildfire until it filled the hall. People rose to their feet, clapping enthusiastically, some wiping away tears. Thomas stepped forward and offered his hand to Rose, helping her to stand. She was trembling slightly, overwhelmed by what had just happened. He led her to the front of the stage and then, in a gesture that spoke volumes, the famous pianist bowed deeply to her. The audience's applause grew even louder. Rose stood there, blinking in the bright lights, trying to process this moment that seemed to belong to someone else's life, not hers. "Who are you?" Thomas asked quietly, so that only she could hear. The question contained wonder and genuine curiosity. Rose opened her mouth to answer, but found she couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. How could she explain the journey that had brought her here? How could she tell him about the young girl who had once practiced until her fingers bled, about the choices and sacrifices that had led her away from music, about the dreams she had carefully packed away but never quite abandoned? "I'm just," she began, then stopped. "Just what? Just a shop owner? Just a mother? Just a woman who had once been a pianist?" Thomas seemed to understand her struggle. "Whoever you are," he said, "you belong here." And in that moment, standing on the stage with the applause washing over her, Rose began to believe that maybe he was right. Thomas gently guided Rose back to the piano bench as the applause continued. He sat beside her, leaning close so she could hear him over the noise. "Would you mind if we played something together?" he asked. "A real duet this time?" Rose's eyes widened. "You want to play with me?" Thomas nodded, his expression earnest. "Very much so." The audience, sensing something special was about to happen, gradually quieted down. Thomas leaned toward the microphone that stood near the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe we've all just witnessed something extraordinary. I invited Rose up here thinking—" He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "Well, to be honest, thinking it might be amusing. Instead, I've been humbled by her talent. And now, with her permission, I'd like to join her for a duet." He turned to Rose. "What shall we play?" Rose thought for a moment. Playing alone had been nerve-wracking enough. Playing alongside Thomas Hill, one of the greatest pianists of his generation, the idea was terrifying. But there was also something else, a sense of rightness, as if her life had been leading to this moment all along. "Do you know Schubert's Fantasia in F minor?" she asked quietly. Thomas's eyebrows shot up in surprise. It was a challenging piece written for 4 hands on one piano, 2 pianists sitting side by side, their hands sometimes crossing, sometimes playing in perfect synchronization. It required not just technical skill but a deep connection between the players. "I do," he said, smiling. "It's one of my favorites, actually." He positioned himself on the bench next to her, their shoulders almost touching. There was a moment of awkwardness as they adjusted to each other's presence. And then Thomas counted softly. 1, 2, 3. They began to play, and from the very first notes something magical happened. Despite never having played together before, despite the vast differences in their lives and experiences, their music flowed together as if they had rehearsed for months. When Thomas took the melody, Rose supported him with harmonies that complemented his every nuance. When it was her turn to lead, he followed her interpretations perfectly, enhancing but never overshadowing her playing. In the audience, people watched in amazement. Robert, Thomas's manager, was frantically whispering to his assistant, "Are you recording this? Tell me you're recording this." The assistant nodded, pointing to the cameras that were always set up at Thomas's concerts to capture footage for promotional materials. Tonight they were capturing something no one could have predicted. As Rose and Thomas played, a strange thing happened to time. For Rose, the years seemed to fold in on themselves. She was simultaneously the young student who had once dreamed of concert halls, the middle-aged woman who had built a life far from those dreams, and someone new, someone being born in this very moment through music. Thomas, too, was experiencing something profound. He had played with many accomplished musicians throughout his career, but there was something different about playing with Rose. Perhaps it was the unexpectedness of it all, or perhaps it was the way she played. not with the polished perfection of his usual collaborators, but with a raw honesty that reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. The Schubert piece moved through its various moods, sometimes playful, sometimes deeply melancholic. Rose and Thomas swayed slightly as they played, their bodies moving in unconscious harmony. At one point, during a particularly emotional passage, Thomas glanced at Rose and saw tears streaming down her face, though her playing never faltered. He felt his own eyes grow moist in response. In the third row, an older man who had been sitting next to Rose turned to his wife and whispered, "I've been coming to classical concerts for 40 years, and I've never heard anything like this." His wife nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. It's like watching two people have a conversation, but with music instead of words. As the piece built toward its climax, Rose felt a surge of joy unlike anything she had experienced in years. She was playing, really playing, not just hitting notes but creating something beautiful, something that touched people's hearts. And she was doing it alongside someone who understood, who could meet her note for note, emotion for emotion. When they reached the final measures of the piece, Thomas followed Rose's lead, allowing her to set the pace for the gentle, wistful conclusion. Their fingers struck the final chords in perfect unison, and then there was silence. That breathless moment after great music ends, when no one wants to be the first to break the spell. Then the audience erupted. The applause was even more thunderous than before, accompanied now by cheers and even some sobs from those most deeply moved. People who had been sitting stood up. Those who were already standing began stamping their feet. Rose and Thomas sat still for a moment, neither quite ready to break the connection that had formed between them through the music. Finally, Thomas stood and extended his hand to Rose. Together they faced the audience and took a bow. As they straightened, Thomas leaned toward the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I came here tonight prepared to entertain you with music I've been practicing for months. Instead, I've been reminded of something important, that music isn't about perfection or preparation. It's about connection. It's about heart." He turned to look at Rose with genuine respect in his eyes. "I don't know Rose's story," he continued, "but I know she has given us all a tremendous gift tonight, and I think I speak for everyone here when I say we would love to hear more." The audience clapped their agreement. Rose felt a moment of panic. More? She had already played more today than she had in public for decades. Her fingers were tired, her emotions raw and exposed. Thomas sensed her hesitation. "Only if you want to," he said quietly, for her ears only. Rose took a deep breath. She thought about all the years she had spent playing alone in the back room of her shop, imagining an audience that wasn't there. She thought about how often she had told herself it was too late to reclaim the dreams of her youth. But was it? Standing here now with hundreds of people looking at her not with mockery but with admiration, with one of the world's great pianists treating her as an equal, perhaps it wasn't too late after all. "One more," she said, nodding slowly. "I'll play one more piece." Thomas smiled warmly and stepped back, giving her the stage. As he moved toward the wings, he caught Robert's eye and made a subtle gesture. His manager nodded, understanding immediately. Whatever happened next, they would make sure it was preserved. Rose sat alone at the piano once more. The spotlight felt warm on her skin, but no longer intimidating. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes, searching for the right piece to play, something that could express everything she was feeling in this extraordinary moment. When she began to play, it was Debussy's Clair de Lune. The piece started softly, like moonlight first appearing on a darkened landscape. Though technically less demanding than the Rachmaninoff or the Schubert, it required a different kind of skill, the ability to create atmosphere, to draw listeners into a world of light and shadow, of gentle beauty and wistful longing. From the first notes, the audience was transfixed. Even those who didn't normally listen to classical music could feel the emotion in her playing. Rose poured everything into the music, her abandoned dreams, her quiet years, her unexpected second chance. The notes shimmered in the air like stars appearing one by one in an evening sky. Watching from the side of the stage, Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He had played Clair de Lune countless times himself, but never quite like this. There was wisdom in her interpretation, a depth that came only from living a full life with all its joys and sorrows. As Rose played the final gentle notes, letting them fade into a silence that felt like a blessing, she knew something had changed forever. Whatever happened next, whether she returned to her quiet life or found a new path, she would never again believe it was too late for dreams to come true. When the final notes of Clair de Lune faded into silence, the audience seemed to hold its collective breath. For several heartbeats, no one moved or made a sound. It was as if they were afraid that any noise might break the spell that Rose had cast over the concert hall. Then, like a wave building slowly before crashing to shore, the applause began. It started with a few people, then spread until everyone was on their feet. The sound was deafening, filling the space with appreciation and wonder. Some people were shouting, "Bravo!" while others simply clapped until their hands hurt. Rose sat motionless at the piano, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. She felt oddly peaceful, as if something that had been knotted inside her for decades had finally come undone. When she finally stood and turned to face the audience, her cheeks were wet with tears, but she was smiling, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. Thomas walked back onto the stage, carrying a bouquet of flowers that someone had thrust into his hands from the front row. He presented them to Rose with a deep bow, then took her hand and raised it high as if announcing the winner of a contest. The audience's applause grew even louder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas said into the microphone, his voice filled with emotion, "Rose Chen." Rose took a bow, clutching the flowers to her chest. As she straightened, she caught sight of an older couple in the front row. The woman was weeping openly while the man looked at Rose with an expression of pure joy. Something about their faces seemed familiar, but in the bright stage lights, she couldn't be sure. As the applause finally began to die down, Thomas leaned toward the microphone again. "I think we can all agree that this has been no ordinary concert," he said. "What began as—" He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "Well, as a rather thoughtless prank on my part, has turned into one of the most remarkable musical experiences of my career." He turned to look at Rose with genuine admiration. "Rose, I don't know your story. I don't know where you learned to play like that or why someone with your talent isn't performing in concert halls around the world. But I do know that music like yours shouldn't be hidden away, so I'd like to make you an offer." Rose looked at him questioningly. "Every year I give a series of charity concerts to raise money for music education programs in underprivileged communities. I'd be honored if you would consider joining me for the remainder of this year's tour. 6 more cities, 6 more chances to share your gift with the world." A murmur of excitement ran through the audience. Rose's eyes widened in shock. Perform in 6 more cities. Leave her shop, her routine, her quiet life. It seemed impossible. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes." Someone shouted from the audience and everyone laughed. "You don't have to answer right now," Thomas said kindly. "Think about it. We'll talk after the show." He turned back to the audience. "And now, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to finish tonight's program as planned. Though I warn you, after what we've just heard, my playing may seem rather ordinary by comparison." The audience laughed and applauded as Thomas escorted Rose off the stage. In the wings, Robert was waiting, his face alight with excitement. "That was incredible," he said, shaking Rose's hand vigorously. "Absolutely incredible. I've already had 3 calls from music journalists who want to interview you." Rose looked alarmed. "Interview me? But I'm nobody," Robert laughed. "Not anymore, you're not. Do you have any idea what just happened out there? Videos are already going up online. By morning, you'll be famous." The idea was so absurd that Rose almost laughed. Famous her? A middle-aged woman who ran a small grocery store and played piano in secret? A young stagehand appeared with a bottle of water for her, which she accepted gratefully. Her hands were shaking slightly as she twisted off the cap. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performances was beginning to wear off, leaving her feeling drained but strangely elated. "There's a small reception room where you can wait until the end of the concert," Robert told her. "Or you're welcome to watch from the wings." Rose chose to stay and watch. As Thomas returned to the stage and began to play his planned program, she marveled at how different everything felt now. Just hours earlier, she had been sitting in the audience, an anonymous face in the crowd, dreaming of a life she thought had passed her by. Now she was backstage at one of the most prestigious concert halls in the country, having just received a standing ovation and an offer to tour with a world-famous pianist. It didn't seem real. Perhaps she would wake up tomorrow to find it had all been a wonderful dream. As Thomas played brilliantly despite his modest disclaimer, Rose found herself studying his technique with new eyes. Not as a fan or an audience member, but as a fellow musician, she noticed the way he approached difficult passages, the slight furrow of concentration between his brows during particularly complex sections, the way his entire body seemed to become part of the music. When the concert finally ended, the audience gave Thomas an enthusiastic ovation, though Rose couldn't help noticing it wasn't quite as fervent as the one she had received. The thought made her cheeks burn with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. After the final bow, Thomas came looking for her. "There you are," he said, his face flushed with the exertion of his performance. "What did you think?" "It was beautiful," Rose said sincerely. "Your Bach was especially moving." Thomas looked pleased. "High praise coming from you. Listen, about my offer, I can't possibly accept," Rose said quickly. "I have responsibilities." "My shop, my apartment, your shop?" "I run a small grocery store. Nothing fancy, just a neighborhood place. I can't just leave it." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. But may I ask you something? When was the last time you played for an audience before tonight?" Rose looked down at her hands. "Not since I was 21, she admitted. "I studied piano at the conservatory in my home country. But then life happened. Marriage, children, immigration. Dreams got put aside, but not abandoned," Thomas said gently. "Not completely, or you wouldn't have been able to play like that tonight." Rose smiled sadly. "I kept a piano in the back room of my shop. I play late at night sometimes when no one can hear." "Until tonight," Thomas said, when everyone heard. Before Rose could respond, there was a commotion at the stage door. Robert appeared, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some people here who insist on seeing Rose. They say they're her family." Rose looked confused. "My family? But they don't even know I'm here. My daughter gave me the ticket as a birthday gift, but she couldn't come herself because of work." Robert stepped aside, and the door opened to reveal the older couple Rose had noticed in the front row. The woman rushed forward, arms outstretched. "Mom!" she cried, enveloping Rose in a tearful embrace. "That was you. That was really you." Rose stood frozen in shock. "Lisa, but how—" "Why are you here?" The older man stepped forward, smiling broadly. "When you told us your daughter had given you a ticket to Thomas Hill's concert, we decided to come too. We wanted to surprise you afterward." He laughed, shaking his head in wonder. "We had no idea we'd be the ones getting the surprise of our lives." Lisa pulled back, her face wet with tears. "Mom, why didn't you tell us? All these years, and we never knew you could play like that." Rose looked embarrassed. "It was from another life. Before you were born, before America. I didn't think it mattered anymore." "Didn't matter?" Lisa's husband joined them, his voice incredulous. "Mom, you're trending online right now. People are calling you the shop owner who stunned the world and the hidden virtuoso. Everyone's talking about you." Rose looked to Thomas in confusion. "Trending? What does that mean?" Thomas smiled. "It means people are sharing videos of your performance. It means they were moved by what you did tonight. It means, Rose-chan, that your music matters very much indeed." Lisa grabbed her mother's hands. "Thomas Hill offered you a tour? You have to do it, Mom, you have to." "But the shop—" "David and I can handle the shop," Lisa said firmly. "It's only for a few weeks, right? You've worked every day for 20 years. It's time you did something for yourself." Rose looked from her daughter to her son-in-law to Thomas, feeling overwhelmed by it all. "I don't know." Thomas stepped closer. "Rose, may I tell you something? When I was 10 years old, my piano teacher took me to see a concert by Vladimir Horowitz. It changed my life. I walked in a boy who played piano because his parents made him practice, and I walked out a boy who knew what he wanted to do forever." He gestured toward the now empty concert hall. "Tonight, there might have been a child in that audience who will be changed by what they heard you play. There might be someone who goes home and dusts off an instrument they haven't touched in years, because you reminded them of the joy music can bring. Your playing could ripple out into the world in ways you can't even imagine." Rose felt tears welling in her eyes again. Could it be true? Could her music, kept hidden for so long, actually make a difference to someone? "Think about it overnight," Thomas suggested gently. "We don't leave for Chicago until the day after tomorrow. You have time to decide." Rose nodded, suddenly exhausted by the emotional roller coaster of the evening. As her family led her toward the exit, she glanced back at Thomas and Robert, still standing in the wings of the stage. Whatever she decided, she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be quite the same again. Rose barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the concert hall, felt the smooth keys beneath her fingers, heard the thunderous applause. She would drift off only to wake again, wondering if it had all been a dream, but it wasn't a dream. The flowers Thomas had given her sat in a vase by her bed. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications as Lisa had helped her set up, messages from friends and regular customers who had somehow seen videos of her performance online. Even the local news had called asking for an interview. By morning, Rose felt like she was living someone else's life. She got up early as usual and went to open her shop, finding comfort in the familiar routine. Stacking fruit, checking inventory, greeting the early customers. These were the constants in her world, the things she understood. But everything had changed. People came in not just to buy groceries, but to see her, to shake her hand, to tell her how moved they had been by her playing. An elderly man who had been shopping at her store for 15 years brought in his granddaughter. "This is the lady I was telling you about," he told the wide-eyed child, the one who plays piano like an angel. By midday, Rose had to sit down in the back room, overwhelmed by it all. Her fingers traced the worn keys of her old upright piano, so different from the magnificent grand she had played the night before. This piano had been her secret companion for years, the keeper of her private joy and sorrow. Now that secret was out, exposed to the world. The bell over the shop door jingled, and Rose heard Lisa's voice calling for her. "Mom, are you here?" Rose emerged from the back room to find her daughter wasn't alone. Thomas Hill stood there, looking slightly out of place among the shelves of groceries in his expensive suit. "I hope you don't mind my stopping by," he said. "I wanted to see where you've been hiding all these years." Rose felt suddenly self-conscious about her small shop with its worn linoleum floor and buzzing fluorescent lights. But Thomas was looking around with genuine interest, not judgment. "So this is where the magic happens," he said, nodding toward the back room where the edge of the piano was visible through the doorway. "Not magic," Rose said quietly. "Just practice. When everyone's gone and the day is done." Thomas smiled. "Isn't that where all magic comes from? Dedication in the quiet moments when no one's watching?" He cleared his throat. "I don't mean to pressure you, but I do need to know about Chicago. The team needs to make arrangements if you're coming with us." Rose looked at her daughter, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "I've worked it all out," Lisa said eagerly. "David and I can run the shop. We've already talked to Mrs. Wu next door, and her son will help stock shelves after school. Everyone wants to make this happen for you, Mom." Rose felt tears threatening again. She had been so focused on what she would be leaving behind that she hadn't considered what she might be gaining, or what she had already gained. The support of her family, the respect of her community, and a chance to reclaim a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. "What if I'm not good enough?" she whispered, finally voicing the fear that had kept her awake all night. Last night might have been a fluke. People might have just been excited because it was unexpected. On a real tour with real critics— "Stop," Thomas said firmly. "I've played with musicians all over the world, people who've been training and performing their entire lives. What you have can't be taught. It can only be felt." He paused, then added more gently, "But if you're truly not ready, I understand. There's no pressure." Rose looked around her shop at the life she had built, safe and predictable. Then she looked at Thomas and her daughter, both watching her with hopeful expressions. Between them stretched two possible futures, one familiar and secure, the other unknown and frightening, but filled with possibilities she had once only dreamed about. "I'll need someone to water my plants," she said finally, and Lisa let out a squeal of delight. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur. From Chicago to Boston to Atlanta and beyond, Rose found herself playing in the most prestigious concert halls in the country. Each night, she and Thomas performed together. Sometimes the Schubert duet that had so moved the audience at their first concert, sometimes other pieces they discovered they both loved. Each night she also played a solo piece. Sometimes it was Chopin or Debussy, composers whose work she had played for years in the privacy of her shop. But as the tour progressed, she found herself growing braver, tackling more challenging pieces, stretching her abilities in ways she hadn't done in decades. Critics raved about the remarkable chemistry between Thomas and the discovery of the decade. Audiences flocked to their concerts, drawn by the story that had now spread across the country, the famous pianist and the shopkeeper whose hidden talent had stunned the world. For Rose, the most meaningful moments weren't the glowing reviews or the standing ovations, though those were certainly gratifying. They were the quiet conversations after shows, when people would approach her with tears in their eyes to tell her what her story meant to them. "I gave up painting when my kids were born," one woman told her. "You've inspired me to pick up a brush again." "I used to play violin," an older man said. "Watching you made me remember how much I loved it." Again and again, people shared their own abandoned dreams, their own secret passions. Rose began to understand what Thomas had meant about ripples spreading outward. Her music, her story was touching people in ways she could never have imagined. The final concert of the tour was held in her hometown, in the same hall where it had all begun. As Rose prepared backstage, she felt a strange sense of having come full circle. 6 weeks ago, she had been sitting in the audience, an anonymous woman in a blue dress. Now she was a performer, about to walk out on stage to play for a sold-out crowd that had come specifically to hear her. Thomas knocked on her dressing room door. "5 minutes," he said, then paused, studying her face. "Are you okay?" "You look a bit lost in thought," Rose smiled. "I was just thinking about how much has changed." "How much I've changed? For the better, I hope?" She nodded. "I feel more alive than I have in years. Like I've been half asleep for decades and finally woke up." Thomas leaned against the doorframe. "So what happens next?" "After tonight?" It was the question Rose had been avoiding. The tour was ending. Soon she would return to her shop, to her old life. But could she really go back to the way things were before? "I've been thinking about that," she said slowly. "The music school at the community center near my shop needs a piano teacher. Their previous one retired last month." Thomas's face lit up. "That sounds perfect." "And?" Rose hesitated, then continued with more confidence. "I'm thinking of doing a small recital series. Nothing fancy. Just once a month at the local church. Accessible classical music for people who might not ever go to a formal concert hall." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Thomas said warmly. "And I hope you'll consider playing as a guest artist at next year's charity tour." Rose laughed. "Let's see how I feel after tonight. I might be ready to retire from touring forever." But as she walked onto the stage a few minutes later, greeted by thunderous applause and beaming faces, Rose knew she would never again hide her music away. Whatever shape her future took, music would be at its center, not as a secret joy, but as a gift to be shared. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. In the front row, she could see Lisa and David, their faces shining with pride. Beside them sat several of her regular customers, the people who had known her only as the quiet woman who ran the neighborhood grocery store. Now they were seeing another side of her, a side she had kept hidden for too long. As she began to play, Rose thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. How Thomas's attempt at a joke had turned into something profound for both of them. How sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. The music flowed from her fingers, filling the concert hall just as it had on that first unexpected night. But this time there was no fear, no hesitation. This time Rose played not as someone who had been called on stage on a whim, but as someone who belonged there, someone who had found her way home after a very long journey. And in the wings, watching with a smile on his face, Thomas Hill silently thanked whatever twist of fate had led him to choose Rose from the audience that night. His little joke had backfired in the most beautiful way possible, reminding him and everyone who heard her play that true talent can be found in the most unexpected places, and that it's never too late for a dream deferred to finally come true.